Etta Slocum could true a wagon wheel blind in the dark. She could feel a warped fellow with 2 fingers and tell you the exact spot the wood had gone soft. But Cottonwood Bend, Kansas, only ever called her one thing: the Wheelwright's spinster girl. One Sunday, she wiped iron filings from her hands before church. The church ladies saw it. They stepped wide of her in the aisle, skirts gathered close, like grease was a thing that jumped. That same summer, Cole Bennett's brand new reaper died dead in a standing sea of wheat. $185 of machine, 300 acres a week from shatter. 40 men stood watching it fail. The company's agent crossed his arms. His name was Marcus Dunmore. He looked at Cole and he looked at the crowd, and he said it loud so all of them heard. Machines are men's business. Farmer, wasn't the machine that failed, was the man running it. Then a girl in a grease-dark apron climbed up on that reaper. Nobody asked her to. She set her father's brass wrench against the knotter. And the whole town held its breath. If you've ever been judged by your dress instead of your heart, this story is for you. Before we go on, if stories like this one mean something to you, take a second and subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? I read every one. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The shop sat at the low end of Main Street, where the road turned to ruts and the town gave up being a town. Slocum and daughter, the sign said. Amos had painted the word daughter himself 3 winters back when his hands still held a brush. Now the paint was flaking. His hands shook too much to fix it. Inside it smelled of oak shavings and hot iron and linseed oil. It was the best smell Etta knew. Better than bread, better than lilac water. She had been breathing it since she was 4 years old, standing on a crate to watch her father bend a rim. She was 26 now. She stood at the forge before dawn most mornings, and she worked past dark most nights, and in between she did the work of 2 men and half the town pretended not to notice. That morning, she was setting a new tire on a farm wagon wheel. It was hard, exact work. You heated the iron band in the fire until it glowed and grew. You dropped it hot over the wooden wheel. Then you had to cool it fast, all at once, so it shrank down tight and gripped every joint at the same instant. Cool it uneven, and the wheel pulled crooked, and you started over. Etta never started over. She had a feel for the moment. She could hear the wood begin to scorch, and she knew, right then, to douse it. Her father sat by the door in the good light, a wheel hub in his lap, turning it slow with fingers that would not close all the way anymore. "You've got the tire hot," he said. He couldn't see the fire from there. He could smell it. "I've got it hot. Don't let it. I won't scorch it. Papa." She lifted the band with the tongs. She dropped it. The wood hissed and smoked, and she was already turning for the water, quick, her whole body one smooth motion, and the steam went up white, and the wheel drank it and held. Round true, she turned it on the bench, and it did not wobble a hair. Amos watched the steam rise. He nodded once. That nod was worth more to her than any word. "Bring me the wrench," he said. "My hands." She brought it to him, the brass wheel wrench. It had been his father's before him. It was old brass gone the color of dark honey, worn smooth as a river stone where 100 years of palms had held it. Heavy, balanced on, one flat somebody long dead had scratched 3 letters, worn near to nothing now. It fit a wheel nut like it had been forged for that one nut, and it fit every other nut just as well. Amos held it a moment. Then he handed it back to her. "You keep it on you now," he said. "My grip's gone. It's yours. The shop's yours." He looked at his own hands like they belonged to somebody else. Not much of an inheritance. A leaning shop and a bad debt. "It's the only inheritance that matters," Etta said. She meant it. She slid the wrench into the long pocket of her apron, where it rode against her hip, and she felt more herself with it there, like a part of her body she'd been missing. "A shop needs a man's name over the door to bring trade," Amos said, quiet. It was an old sorrow of his, worn smooth as the brass. "When I'm gone, they'll take their wheels to Hutchinson. Then I'll go to Hutchinson and bring the wheels back." He laughed at that. It turned into a cough. She fetched him water and did not let her face show the worry. Out on Main Street, the town went by. The Reverend's wife and her sister, Sunday stiff, though it was only Thursday, some women wore Sunday all week. They glanced in at the open shop door. They saw Etta at the forge, sleeves shoved up, a smear of black across her jaw. They looked away quick, the way you look away from a thing that isn't decent. Etta had a name for that look. She'd been getting it her whole life. She wore it like she wore the grease. It didn't come off, so you stopped scrubbing. There was a widower named Cole Bennett whose land ran along Cottonwood Creek north of town. Everybody in 3 townships knew his business that summer, because his business had become the town's favorite worry. He'd mortgaged 40 acres. 40 acres of his dead father's ground, put up against a note at the Drovers and Farmers Trust, all to buy one machine. An Ainsworth self-raking reaper, freighted in on the railroad, gleaming red and green paint and bright steel, the newest thing the company made. It could cut and rake in one pass what 6 men with cradle scythes cut in a day. That was the promise. That was what the agent said. $185, due at the end of harvest. Cole had wheat. He had 300 acres of it, standing tall and going gold, the best stand his ground had ever thrown. If the machine cut it, he'd pay the note and keep the land, and have grain money left to carry the farm through winter. If it didn't, the note would come due against ripe grain rotting in the field, and the bank would take the 40 acres, and 40 was the heart of it, the piece with the well and the good bottom soil. He was 34. He had a boy's stubbornness and an old man's worry, and he'd buried his wife Della 2 years back and never once said her name out loud since, though he still turned to tell her things and found the air empty. The wheat wouldn't wait. That was the thing about wheat. It ripened all at once across the whole county, and once it ripened you had maybe a week, 10 days if the weather held kind, before the heads got brittle and shattered and spilled the kernels on the ground where you couldn't gather them. A week to bring in a year. That clock ran the same for every farmer in the valley, and it was ticking, and Cole Bennett had bet his father's land that a machine he'd never run would beat it. He rolled the reaper out at first light on a Monday. He'd greased every fitting. He'd read the little folded instruction paper by lamplight until he could have recited it. He hitched his 2 horses, and he climbed to the seat, and his hired man Willem walked alongside. And the first stand of wheat went down before the blade in a clean falling wave, and Cole's heart came up in his throat, because it was working. It was actually working. The raking arms swept the cut stalks into a neat gavel and dropped it, and behind him lay a swath of stubble as tidy as a barbered head. He got maybe 200 feet. Then the machine screamed. Not a loud sound. A wrong sound, a grinding shriek down in the gears, metal biting metal where it shouldn't, and then a hard jolt that near threw him off the seat, and the horses spooked and the whole thing lurched and stopped. The blade quit. The rakes froze mid-sweep. Something deep in the knotting and driving works had seized up solid. Cole sat there in the sudden quiet with the wheat whispering all around him. He got down. He looked. He pried, and he pulled, and he cussed, and he read the paper again. Willem helped him. They got nowhere. The drive shaft would not turn. It was locked like the machine had died and gone stiff. By afternoon word had gone out, the way word does. By the next morning there were men in Cole's field. Neighbors, some to help, some just to see. You didn't get many chances to watch a $185 gamble come apart, and folks will drive a long way for that show. And Marcus Dunmore came. Dunmore was the Ainsworth district agent, The man who'd sold Cole the machine in the first place, silk necktie and clean boots, and a way of talking that made you feel slow. He drove out in a light buggy, and he looked at the dead reaper standing in the wheat, and something crossed his face for just a second. Etta saw it later, when she thought back. It wasn't surprise. It was more like a man checking a thing off a list. "Well now," Dunmore said. He walked around the machine. He didn't kneel to it. He didn't get grease on those boots. "That's a shame, Bennett. That is a shame." "It just quit," Cole said. 200 feet and it quit. I greased her, I ran her by the paper, course you did." Dunmore's voice was warm and awful. "But these machines, they're precision instruments. Delicate. A man mishandles the timing, forces the drive, doesn't set the tension just so. He spread his hands. Well, you can't blame the maker for that. I didn't force nothing. I'm sure you believe that." Dunmore turned to the other men, and now he was talking to the crowd, not to Cole, and his voice got bigger. "This is the trouble, gentlemen. Fine equipment in untrained hands. The Ainsworth Company can't warranty a machine against rough handling. It's right there in the paper Mr. Bennett signed." He smiled. "And I'll remind you, Bennett, friendly, the note falls due at the close of harvest, whether you bring your wheat in or not." That landed on the field like a stone in a pond. Every man there did the arithmetic. Note due. Wheat dying. Machine dead. And the company washing its hands. Cole didn't say anything. His jaw worked. There was nothing to say. He was a proud man, and he'd been made small in front of 40 of his neighbors, and worse, he half believed it. He'd never run a reaper before. Maybe he had forced it. Maybe it was his fault. That was the poison in what Dunmore did. He made a man doubt his own hands. Now, Etta Slocum was there that day. She'd ridden out with old Henry Coldwell, whose wheel she'd fixed, because Henry wanted to see the machine and offered her a seat, and she was curious. She was always curious about a machine. She stood at the back of the crowd, apron on under her shawl, the brass wrench a familiar weight at her hip, and she watched. She didn't watch Dunmore's show. She watched the reaper. While the men listened to the agent, Etta drifted up close to the dead machine, quiet, the way she moved when she was reading a thing with her eyes. She looked at the seized drive. She looked at the knotter, the clever, cruel little mechanism that tied each sheaf. She crouched, careful of her skirt, and looked underneath at the pitman and the connecting works where the shriek would have come from. And her eye caught on the maker's plate. Every machine had one. A little brass rectangle riveted to the frame, stamped with the company name and the model, and a run of numbers, the serial and the pattern, and, on an Ainsworth, a bulletin number. The makers stamped a bulletin number so they could track which batch a part came from. Etta had read 100 makers' plates on 100 machines. She read them the way other women read faces. This one had been filed. One corner of the plate, right where the bulletin number should have been stamped, had been ground smooth. Not worn. Filed, you could see the bright scratch marks of the file still in the brass, fresh, deliberate. Somebody had taken a file to that plate and erased one number and left the rest. Etta looked at it a long moment. Now why, she thought, would a man file a number off a brand new machine? She didn't say a word. It wasn't her machine. It wasn't her field, and it surely wasn't her place. A woman didn't offer opinions on men's equipment in a field full of men, not in Cottonwood Bend, not if she wanted to sell wheels next week. So she stood up, and she smoothed her skirt, and she filed the thing away in her own memory instead. The filed plate. The fresh scratches, she tucked it back in her mind the way she tucked the wrench in her pocket. She would remember it. Etta forgot nothing about a machine. The town, meanwhile, had another project that summer besides worrying over Cole Bennett's note. The town's project was Etta. Not Etta's happiness, mind, Etta's propriety. It had become a small crusade among the better ladies of Cottonwood Bend that the Wheelwright's girl, 26 and greased to the elbow and not getting younger, ought to be settled. Settled was the word they used, like she was dust, and marriage was the damp cloth. And they had a candidate. Preston Vane. The grain broker. He'd come to the Bend 3 years back and prospered. A good coat, a good horse, a hand in everybody's harvest, because Vane was the man who arranged the financing, who knew the banks, who fronted the paper for half the machines and half the seed in the valley. He was respectable in the way that money makes a man respectable. He was exactly the sort the ladies meant when they said a girl ought to settle. They had put it in his head that Etta Slocum, tidied up, would do. And Vane, who liked the idea of a wife the town would approve of and a shop he could fold into his interests, had let himself be steered. He came to the shop one afternoon in his good coat. Etta was reboring a hub, up to her wrists in it, when his shadow fell across the door. She knew who it was before she looked, because he'd stopped just inside where the sun still hit him and the shop shadow didn't. "Miss Slocum," Vane said. "Mr. Vane, I wonder if I might speak with you." Somewhere, his eyes went around the shop, the iron, the shavings, the forge, and his nose did a small thing. "Cleaner. The hotel does a decent tea." "I'm working, Miss Vane." "Yes," he said it like it was the problem he'd come to solve. "That's rather what I'd hoped to discuss. A woman of he searched, your evident industry. Surely you tire of it. A person could be lifted out of all this." He gestured at the shop. At her life. At the smell she loved. Into something more suited. Etta wiped her hands on her apron. Slow, she looked at him. She was not a small woman, and she did not shrink in her own shop. More suited to what? Mr. Vane, to a lady. She let that sit. Behind her, her father had gone very still in his chair by the wall, listening. "I true wheels," Etta said. "I set tires, I bend iron, I keep this shop, and I keep my father, and I'm good at all of it. There's not much in this town more suited to me than exactly this." She picked the hub back up. "Was there something you needed made? Or was that all?" Preston Vane's face did a slow, cold thing. He was not a man used to being handed his hat by a girl in an apron. He put his hat back on. "Good day, Miss Slocum." At the door he paused, and he couldn't help it. He had to leave a mark. He looked at her stained hands and he said, "A pity. Those could have been made into something." He left. His good coat carried a little of the shop's iron smell out into the street, and Etta hoped it clung all day. Almost let out a breath. "You didn't have to run him off quite so clean. I had to run him off. He fronts half the paper in the valley, Etta. He can make a shop's credit go dry." She hadn't thought of that. She thought of it now, and filed it too, next to the scratched maker's plate. But she didn't take it back. She'd have run Preston Vane off with an anvil if she'd had to. There was one man in the whole county who didn't do the thing everybody did. She noticed it the day of Cole Bennett's dead machine. At the end, when the crowd broke up. Somebody had needed to know if the seized shaft could be broke free with a jack and a pry, and old Henry, who'd brought her, said loud enough, "Ask the Slocum girl. She'll tell you true. She knows iron better'n any man here." Half a joke, half not. And a few men laughed the uncomfortable laugh. And Cole Bennett, standing there beaten in his ruined gamble, put out his hand to her. A man's shake. Straight across. Like she was a fellow tradesman he was asking a straight question. She shook it. Her hand was grease-dark and calloused, and it disappeared in his, which was worse, farmer's hands. "Can it be freed?" he asked her. "Just that. Not can a man free it. Not what would your father say?" He asked her. "Maybe," she said. "I'd have to see what's seized." "But maybe," he nodded, serious, taking her word like it was worth taking. And then, and this was the thing, this was the small thing that stuck in her like a burr, he did not wipe his hand. Every man wiped his hand after Etta shook it. Discreet, on a trouser leg, thinking she didn't see. She always saw. It was so common, she'd stopped feeling it. Cole Bennett let the grease stay on his palm like it was nothing, like it was just work. He turned and walked back to his dead machine, with her mark still on his hand, and Etta stood there in the stubble feeling something she didn't have a name for and didn't trust. She told herself it was nothing. A man too worried to think about his hands. But she remembered it. She remembered everything. The wheat kept ripening. It didn't care about notes or agents or pride. Each dry gold day it got a little more brittle, and the wind ran through it, and Cole could see, God help him, he could see kernels dropping. The shatter had started. His year was falling on the ground a few grains at a time, and his machine stood dead in the middle of it, like a monument to his mistake. 6 days after the reaper died, the crowd came back. Bigger, because word had spread that Cole Bennett was finished, and there is nothing draws a farming country like the fall of a neighbor who reached too high. 40 men, maybe more, gathered in and around that field on a hot, bright Saturday with a wind that carried the smell of the ripe grain and rattled the heads. And every rattle was money leaving the ground. Dunmore was there again. He'd made a habit of it. He had his eye on that 40 acres, though nobody knew it yet, and he liked to be near a thing when it fell. Cole had tried everything. He'd had 2 neighbors and a Hutchinson blacksmith at the machine over the week, and none of them had freed it. The blacksmith had shaken his head and said the drive was ruined, said Cole'd have to freight the whole works back to the factory, and by the time it came back, the wheat would be 6 weeks shattered and gone. So Cole stood by his dead reaper on that Saturday, with the note in his mind and his father's land in his mind, and 40 men watching. And he was a man at the bottom of a well, looking up. Etta was there. She'd come on her own this time. She'd told herself she wanted to see if they'd freed it. That was a lie, and she half knew it. She'd come because she couldn't stop thinking about that machine. She'd lain awake, thinking about the seized drive and the filed plate, turning it in her mind like a wheel, and she had a notion, more than a notion, of what had happened in there, and the notion wouldn't let her sleep. She stood at the edge of the crowd in her work apron, the brass wrench at her hip, and she listened to the men declare the thing dead. And Marcus Dunmore, seeing his moment, played it big. He climbed up on the buggy steps so they could all see him, and he spread it out for the crowd, the sad wise speech, the delicate machine, the untrained hand. The note that would fall due, the Ainsworth company that could not be blamed. He was good at it. Half the field was nodding. Then old Henry Coldwell, who was ornery and had known Etta since she was a baby and didn't give a damn what was proper, spoke up from the crowd. Slocum girl could likely tell you what's wrong with it. She's forgot more about iron than most men here'll learn. A ripple went through the crowd. Some laughed. Some looked at Etta, who had gone still. Dunmore looked at her too, up on his buggy step, and he laughed, easy and cutting, and he delivered the line he thought would end it. Machines are men's business, girl. He smiled down at her apron, her hands, the whole of her. Go on home and mend a butter churn. The field laughed. Not all of it, but enough to sting. And something in Etta Slocum, some patience worn as thin as the paint on the shop sign, finally gave. She didn't answer Dunmore. She never in her life won anything by answering a man like Dunmore with words. She answered the only way that had ever worked for her, in her whole grease-stained life. She answered with her hands. She walked out of the crowd, straight through it, into the open, into the trampled stubble where the dead machine stood, and 40 men watched a woman in an apron cross into men's business, and the laughing sort of died in their throats, because there's something about a person who walks like they know exactly where they're going. She didn't ask Cole's leave. She looked at him once, a quick look, and he looked back, and whatever he saw in her face, he didn't stop her. He gave her the smallest nod. Go on. Etta climbed up onto the reaper. She got a boot on the frame, and a hand on the seat, and hauled herself up into the works of it, skirt and all, and she crouched down over the seized drive where the knotter and the pitman lived, and she pulled the brass wrench from her apron pocket. Her father's wrench, her grandfather's wrench, the honey-colored brass catching the Kansas sun. The field went dead quiet. Even the wind seemed to drop. 40 men and Marcus Dunmore and Cole Bennett, with his whole life on the ground, all of them watching a spinster in a grease-dark apron set an old brass wheel wrench against a broke machine, and not one of them breathing. She found the drive housing. She felt along it with her fingers, reading it, the way she'd read a warped fellow in the dark. She found where the shaft went in, and where the pitman connected the drive to the cutting bar, and she found the pin. The pitman pin. The little forged pin that took all the pounding, all the drive of the whole machine, the one part that turned steady power into hard back-and-forth stroke. She got the wrench on the housing bolt. She braced her boot, and she leaned into it with her whole back and shoulder, and the old brass didn't slip because it never slipped, and the bolt cracked loose. She turned it out. She turned out the next. She lifted the housing plate. And there it was. She could see it plain as a broke tooth. The pitman pin had sheared. Not worn through, not fatigued from years, this machine was 200 feet old. It had sheared clean and fresh, broken across, and the broken end had jammed sideways and bound the whole drive solid. The pin had failed on the first hard morning of work because the pin was bad. Bad iron, or bad forging, brittle where it should have been tough. It hadn't been Cole's hand at all. The man had done nothing wrong. The heart of the machine had been rotten the day it came off the freight car. Etta held the sheared pin up in the sunlight and looked at the broken face of the metal, the way you look at the grain of a broke thing to read how it died. She knew that break. She'd seen bad iron her whole life at the forge. This pin had never had a chance, and she thought again of the filed maker's plate. The bulletin number ground off, and something cold and certain settled in her chest. But that was for later. Right now there was a field of dying wheat and 40 watching men, and a machine to raise from the dead. She looked down from the reaper at Cole Bennett. "It's the pin," she called out, plain and clear, so the whole field heard her. "The pitman pin sheared. It's not your handling. It was never your handling. This machine came to you broke." She let that hang a second in front of all of them. "Then, you got a forge on the place? And scrap iron, wagon iron, a length of good bar?" Cole found his voice. "Forge, yes, in the barn. Iron, some, then bring me your best piece of it." She was already unbolting the sheared pin, working fast now, her hands sure. "And somebody water these horses, we'll want them fresh. And you, this to Willem the hired man, I'll need the fire hot. Proper hot." Nobody moved for a second. It was too strange. A woman giving orders off a reaper seat. "Well," Etta said, "the wheat's not getting greener." That broke it. Cole moved first, running for the barn, and then Willem, and old Henry, cackling and slapping his knee, and a couple of the younger men, half sheepish, went to help. The crowd didn't disperse. It couldn't. It had come to watch a man fall, and it was watching something else now, and it did not know yet what. Marcus Dunmore came down off his buggy step. The easy smile was gone off his face. He walked toward the reaper, and there was a new tightness around his eyes, and Etta, glancing up from her work, saw it and understood it, though the field did not. He wasn't watching a woman make a fool of herself. He was watching a woman find a sheared pin. "That won't hold," Dunmore said, loud, for the crowd, but his voice had lost its music. "You can't forge a precision part in a barn. You'll ruin the machine and void the note both. Bennett, you let this girl touch that machine, the company will hold you." "The company," Etta said, not looking up, her father's brass wrench steady in her grip, filed the bulletin number off this plate before it sold Mr. Bennett the machine. She said it quiet. But quiet carries in a still field. Now why would a company do that, Mr. Dunmore? Dunmore's mouth opened. Nothing came out. And 40 men, who hadn't understood a word about pins or bulletins, understood that look on the agent's face just fine, because it was the look of a man who's had a card turned over he thought was still hidden. The sun stood near the top of the sky. The forge in Cole Bennett's barn was coming up to heat. 300 acres of wheat rattled in the wind, shedding, waiting, and a Wheelwright's spinster girl bent over a broken reaper with her father's wrench in her hand and told the whole watching town she meant to have it cutting. By noon, she said. The clock started ticking on those 2 words. And down at the depot in a crate nobody had opened yet, a paper weighted with Marcus Dunmore's whole scheme written plain, if only the right hands ever found it. The forge fire in Cole Bennett's barn climbed to a color Etta knew by heart, not red. Red was for the careless. She wanted the straw-yellow heart, the heat that lets iron move like clay without burning its soul out. Willem worked the bellows the way she told him. Slow, even, she did not rush the boy, and she did not rush the fire. She had the sheared pitman pin laid on the anvil beside a rod of good stock. Not the depot iron. Her own. She'd carried a bundle of it in the shop wagon for 11 years, the way some women carry a Bible. That'll never match the machine, Dunmore said from the barn door. He'd followed her in. Away from the crowd, his voice had gone lower and meaner. Every part in that reaper is factory cut. You forge one by hand, the tolerances won't hold. It'll shear again in a week. It sheared this one in 200 feet, Etta said. She didn't look up. So a week would be an improvement, wouldn't it, mister? Dunmore behind him, Cole Bennett stood in the light. He said nothing. But he did not leave. She heated the rod. She drew it down under the hammer, and the sound of it filled the barn, a clean ringing that the depot pin had never been given. She'd measured the housing twice. She'd measured the old pin's seat 3 times, reading the wear on it like a track in mud, learning exactly where the load had come and where the bad iron had failed. A factory made 1,000 pins the same. She was making 1 pin for 1 machine, and she knew that machine now better than the men who'd bolted it together. The town waited in the field. The wheat kept shedding. She quenched the pin. She dressed it on the stone. She carried it out into the white noon light with her father's brass wrench in her other hand, and 40 men went quiet as a church. Cole climbed up first and put his hand down for her without thinking about it. She took it. That was the platform. That was a centimeter, though neither of them counted it then. She set the pin. She timed the knotter to the pitman, turning the whole train by hand, feeling for the bind, backing it off a hair, feeling again. Her father had taught her that a machine tells you when it's right. You don't force it right, you listen until it stops fighting you. It stopped fighting her. Drive it, she said. Cole put the team into the wheat. The reaper's sails came around. The knife sang. And the sheaves came off the platform tied true, one after another, dropping into the stubble like loaves off a baker's board. Somebody in the crowd made a sound. Not a cheer. Something rougher than a cheer. The sound men make when a thing they were sure of turns out wrong in front of them. Henry Coldwell, old and bent, took his hat off. "I've known Amos Slocum 40 years, he said, to no one and to everyone. That girl's got his hands and his father's before him. I've said it, and I'll keep saying it." The sun stood at the top of the sky. She'd said by noon. It was noon. Marcus Dunmore stood at the edge of the field with his notebook shut in his hand, and he was not looking at the reaper. He was looking at Etta. And she understood, watching him back, that she had made an enemy who would not forget it. Cole Bennett came down off the machine. He wiped his palm on his trousers, and then, seeing what he'd done, he stopped, and he held the hand out to her still dusty. "I've got 300 acres, he said, "and one machine that only one person in this county can keep running." He swallowed. "I'll pay a field wage, same I'd pay any man. Will you stay the harvest?" The town heard it. A woman. In the field. Alone with a widower, day on day. She heard the intake of breath run through the crowd like wind through the wheat. "I'll stay," Etta said. And that was the scandal planted, right there in the stubble, in front of 40 witnesses, at noon. The wage saved the shop, she told her father that night, and Etta Slocum sat in his chair by the cold stove and worked his shaking hands one over the other, and did not trust his voice for a while. "You be careful of that Dunmore," he said finally. "A man like that, you don't beat him in a field. You beat him, and he goes and finds a quieter place to cut you." "I know it, Pa, and you be careful of the other thing." He didn't look at her. A field wage is a field wage. A man's coat over your shoulders at sundown is not. She hadn't told him about the coat. She looked at her father and understood he'd been young once, and had eyes still. The days in the field ran together the way good days do. She learned things about Cole Bennett a wage doesn't buy. She learned he didn't eat when he was worried. Noon would come and she'd see his dinner sitting untouched on the wagon board, and she started, without a word, cutting his bread for him and putting it in his hand, because a man will eat a thing that's already in his hand. She learned he'd stop the team sometimes at the top of a rise and just look at the land, and she came to know he wasn't resting. He was counting. Acres against a note. He learned things too. He learned she took her coffee black and bitter, no sugar though he offered it twice, and after the second time he stopped offering and just poured it black and set it by her, and that was a thing he knew about her that no one else in the county knew. At dusk the heat would let go of the ground, and the chill would come up sudden off the river, and one evening he took his coat off and put it over her shoulders while she bent over the knotter, and he didn't say anything, and she didn't either, and they both pretended it hadn't happened. It kept happening. That was the way of it. It kept happening, and they kept pretending. Out on the western edge of the sky, the first bruise of a storm sat low one afternoon and did not move. She saw Cole see it, ripe wheat and coming weather. The clock she'd beaten once was still running, then came the Grange social, and the dress. She hadn't wanted to go. Her mother's cousins sent over a dress, blue, plain but good, and Etta stood in it in the shop and felt like iron pretending to be tin. She'd scrubbed her hands with lye and sand till they hurt. It didn't matter. The grease lived in the cracks of a working hand the way years live in a wheel. You can't scrub out what a life put there. She walked into the Grange hall, and the room looked at her hands. She saw them do it. The church ladies, the merchants' wives, the eyes dropping from her face to her hands and back, and the small tightening at the mouths. There goes the Wheelwright's girl, playing at being a lady. Preston Vane was there in a good coat, and he came toward her the way a man comes to do a duty, and he took her hand and looked down at it as he did, and something crossed his face he didn't trouble to hide. "Miss Slocum," he said, "you've been laboring, I hear, in the Bennett field. People talk, you know. A woman ought to think of her name. A woman ought to think of her father's shop," Etta said, "since no one else in this town thought to." Vane's smile thinned. He let go of her hand like it had warmed past comfort. Across the room, Cole Bennett set down his cup. He crossed the whole floor. The fiddle was going. He crossed it in front of the merchants and the wives and Preston Vane, and he stopped in front of Etta Slocum in her borrowed blue dress, and he put his hand out. "Dance with me," he said. The room did not breathe. "I don't know how," she said, low. "Neither do I," he said. "We'll ruin it together." And she put her scarred, scrubbed, grease-cracked hand in his, and Cole Bennett danced with the Wheelwright spinster girl in front of the whole of Cottonwood Bend, badly, both of them, and it was the truest thing that had happened in that hall in 20 years, and everyone there knew it, and half of them hated it. Preston Vane watched from the wall, and when he'd watched enough, he went and found Marcus Dunmore by the door, and the two of them stood talking low, in the way of men who have just discovered they want the same thing broken. The reapers began to die. First it was the Kessler place, 4 miles east. Their Ainsworth machine seized the second morning, dead in the wheat, and Etta rode out and lifted the drive housing and found the pitman pin sheared clean across, the same break, the same bad grain in the iron, the same as Cole's. She forged them a new one. She didn't wait to be asked twice. She fixed it and rode home. Then it was the Doyle place. Then 2 more the same day, over toward the river. She stood in the Doyle's yard with a broken pin in her palm, and the truth came up in her all at once, cold and complete. Not one machine, not Cole's handling, not Kessler's, not Doyle's. Every one of them the same. The same sheared pin. The same bad batch of iron. It wasn't the men. It was never the men. She rode back to the Bennett place at dark, and Cole was in the barn, and she didn't stop to think about the wage or the town or her name. "Cole," she said. He turned. It was the first time she'd used it. His given name, just the once, and it stopped him where he stood. "This is the machine," she said, "not the men. Every one of these that's died has died the same way. The same pin, the same iron. It's not you. It never was you. Somebody sold this whole county a bad machine and let it call good farmers careless." He looked at her a long moment in the lantern light. "You can prove that?" he said. "I can prove it's the same failure every time," she said. "I've got the pins. But somebody sold these knowing. And I mean to prove that too." She began forging pins for the whole valley. She'd ride out at first light with a bundle of good iron and a fire, and she'd raise a farmer's dead reaper and put a Slocum pin in it and have it cutting by noon, and she stopped charging after the third one because these were people a bad harvest would break. She saved harvests up and down the Cottonwood Valley that fall, 1 pin at a time, and half the farms she saved never quite understood what she'd done for them. And while she rode saving them, Marcus Dunmore rode too. He carried a different kind of paper. He went to the farms whose reapers had failed, the ones she hadn't reached yet, or reached too late, the wheat already shattered in the field, and he laid the notes on their tables. Machine failed through mishandling. Warranty void. Note due. And when they couldn't pay, because the grain that would have paid it was lying dead in the stubble, the Drovers and Farmers Trust took the land, and the man who bought it back cheap, through a broker, through Preston Vane, was Ainsworth. The audience of the whole county could have seen it, if the county had known to look. Ripe land, bought for pennies, off the back of a machine sold to fail. But the town didn't look. The town blamed itself. Each broken farmer thought he'd been the careless one, the one man who couldn't run what other men ran, and the shame of it kept him quiet, and the quiet was the whole design. Etta saw the pattern before she had the proof. She saw it the way you see the shape of a wheel from a single broken spoke. But seeing isn't proving, and she knew Dunmore knew that too. Then she went to the depot for the filed plate. She hadn't forgotten it. The maker's plate on Cole's reaper, riveted to the frame, with its corner filed smooth where a bulletin number should have stamped. A machine carries its history in its numbers the way a wheel carries it in its wear. Somebody had ground that history off on purpose, and a thing filed off in one place, she reasoned, might sit whole in another. There was a crate at the depot, a return shipment, come back down the line weeks before and never claimed, sitting in the freight shed under a tarp because no agent had signed for it. She knew whose agency it belonged to. She waited until the depot man went to his supper, and she was not proud of what she did next, but she did it. She opened the crate. Machine parts. Packing straw. And under the straw, in an oilcloth folder, the papers that shipped with a factory return. An Ainsworth Harvester Company internal repair bulletin. Number 40. She read it standing in the freight shed by a lantern turned low, and her hands, that did not shake at a forge with white iron a foot from her face, shook holding a sheet of paper. The pitman pin, batch bulletin 40, forged of substandard stock, will fail under field load. All district agents are advised. The company knew. It knew before it sold a single machine in the Cottonwood Valley. And the bulletin did not order a recall. It ordered concealment. Attribute field failures to operator error. Do not extend warranty. Allow notes to proceed to term. The jam was not an accident. The jam was the product. Sell a machine built to fail, blame the farmer when it does, and take his land when the harvest he bet on it dies in the field. She had it. The whole scheme, in the company's own words, with the filed bulletin number written out plain at the top, 40. She folded the paper into the long pocket of her apron, next to her father's brass wrench, and she rode home in the dark with the two heaviest things she'd ever carried. Marcus Dunmore came to the shop the next afternoon. He didn't shout. That was how she knew to be afraid. He stood in the door of Slocum and Daughter with his hat in his hand, and he was gentle as a snake in cool weather. "I hear you've been in the freight shed," he said, "tampering with company property. A woman, tampering with machines." He turned the word over. "That's a thing a jury hears one way about a man and another way about a woman, Miss Slocum." "You knew," she said. Bulletin 40. "You knew the pins were bad, and you let them call these men careless, and you took their land for it." "I know," Dunmore said softly, "that Amos Slocum buys his stock and his coal on 30-day credit through the Drovers and Farmers Trust. He let that sit, and I know the trust listens to Ainsworth about who's a sound risk in this valley and who's a troublemaker. Your father's an old man with bad hands and one asset in the world. This shop." He smiled. It would be a shame if his credit dried up in a single afternoon over his daughter's reputation. She said nothing. "You've got a paper," he said. "Burn it, and I never think of you again. Wave it around, and I'll ruin your father, brand you a saboteur, and see this shop shut by Christmas. You're a smart girl. Do the smart thing." He put his hat on and left. He did not raise his voice once. That evening, at the depot, it fell apart. She'd asked Cole to meet her there. She meant to tell him what she had and what Dunmore had threatened, and to decide together what to do. The bankman was there, though, and pressed in vain. And half the street, because word of a bad harvest travels, and word of foreclosures travels faster. The bankman had Cole's note in his hand, and he said, loud enough for the street, that the Bennett reaper had failed like the others, that the harvest was in question, that Ainsworth had raised concerns about irregular repairs performed on the machine, repairs not by a licensed agent, but by an unlicensed hand. He looked at Etta when he said it, and there it was. The choice, laid on Cole Bennett in front of the town. Stand with the woman who'd saved his harvest, and let the bank call his repairs fraud, his note void, his father's 40 acres forfeit. Or step back, let the town believe his own crew had freed the machine, keep the note sound, keep the land. She watched him choose. "The repairs on my machine," Cole said, slow, not looking at her, "were done by my crew. Under my direction." His jaw worked. "I don't know anything about a woman tampering with company property." The street heard it. Etta heard it. He kept his eyes on the bankman. He would not turn them to her. And she understood that this was mercy in his mind, that he thought he was shielding her father's shop and his father's land both, that a man who measures worth in acres would measure this as the sound thing, the protecting thing. She understood it. It did not help. She'd been made invisible in front of a crowd once before, in a field, by a man who said machines were men's business. She'd climbed a reaper and made herself seen. And now the man she'd danced with, badly, the man who knew she took her coffee black, had unseen her again in front of the whole street, and this time she had no machine to climb. She took her father's brass wrench out of her apron. She walked to the Bennett reaper, standing hitched at the depot rail. She laid the wrench on the seat. His seat, where he'd sit to drive the harvest her hands had saved. Then she went home, and she did not run, and she did not let them see her face. The Grange convened over the foreclosures within the week. It had to. Half the valley was going under at once, and even the men too proud to speak of their own machine could count how many machines had died the same season. 40 farms. The same story on every one. The Grange hall filled, the same men from the field, the same 40 and more. Dunmore was there, at the front, with the bankman and Preston Vane, and the Ainsworth papers spread out neat, ready to make the failures into fault and the fault into forfeit, farm by farm, the way it had gone all fall. Cole Bennett came in late. Etta was not there. She was in the shop with her father, and she had told herself she was done, and she had almost made herself believe it. Cole stood at the back of the Grange hall and looked at the men he'd grown up with, about to lose the land their fathers broke, and he looked at Marcus Dunmore laying out the paper that would take it, and he understood. The way a slow man finally understands a thing all at once. That he had put his father's 40 acres above the only person who had ever handed him the truth. He walked to the front. He didn't ask the chair for the floor. He took it. "I lied last week," Cole Bennett said. "At the depot. In front of you. My crew never fixed my reaper. My crew couldn't have. Not one of us could have, and every man here knows it, because every man here's tried and failed to free his own." He drew a breath. Etta Slocum freed mine. By noon, like she said, she retimed the knotter, and she forged a new pin with her own hands, and she's forged one for near every farm in this valley that's still got a harvest to speak of. Kessler, Doyle, the Vances out by the river. Ask them. Ask them whose hands saved your grain. The room stirred. "And here's the thing they didn't tell you," Cole said, and he reached into his coat. He laid a paper on the Grange table, Etta's paper. She'd left it with him at the depot, in the folder before he chose wrong, and he'd kept it, and now he smoothed it flat under the lamps where every man could lean and look. "Ainsworth Bulletin 40, Cole said. "The company's own. It says the pins were made of bad iron. It says they'd fail in the field. And it says, read it yourselves, that the agents were to blame the failures on us, on the men running them. And let the notes fall due, and take the land." He looked at Dunmore. "They knew before they sold us a single machine. The jam wasn't an accident, boys. The jam was the sale." The hall came up off its benches. Marcus Dunmore was on his feet fast. "That paper is stolen company property. A forgery, likely. You'll note it comes from the same unlicensed hand that's been tampering with. It's got your agency stamp on it," Cole said, "and a bulletin number filed off every plate in this county, but printed right there at the top of that sheet. Number 40. You want to tell these men their machines don't carry a number you ground off yourself?" Henry Coldwell was already bent over the paper, and old Coldwell had been a court clerk before his eyes went, and he read slow and aloud, and the room went from noise to a low, deadly quiet as the company's own words came out in an old man's voice. Dunmore tried once more. He drew himself up, and he reached for the line that had worked in a wheat field in front of 40 men. The line that had never once failed him. "Gentlemen," he said, "machines are men's business. You'll not take the word of a spinster girl with grease under her." The Grange hall laughed him down. It started somewhere in the back, and it rolled forward, and it was not a kind laugh. It was 40 men who'd been made fools of, laughing at the man who'd done it, and it broke him where he stood. Because a man like Dunmore can survive being hated, but cannot survive being funny. He stood in it with his face going gray, and the paper on the table saying everything he'd built his year on was a lie in his own company's hand. "Send for her," Cole said. "Send for Etta Slocum. Let her show you." They sent for her. She came because Henry Coldwell came for her himself, hat in his hands, and because her father said, "Go, girl, go be seen." She walked into the Grange hall in her working apron, no borrowed dress, her real hands, and the room that had pitied her all her life went silent as she came up the middle of it. There were 2 reapers outside the hall, run in from the yard. One fitted with an Ainsworth pin, batch 40. One fitted with a Slocum pin she'd forged that morning. Cole had set it up. He'd trusted her to end it. She didn't make a speech. She'd never been good at speeches. She put the first reaper into a bound test sheaf of wheat somebody'd hauled up, turned the drive, and 200 feet of equivalent load in. The Ainsworth pin sheared clean across with a crack the whole haul heard, and the machine went dead. Then she stepped to the second. Her pin. She turned the drive, and the knife sang, and the knotter tied, and it ran, and it kept running, and it did not stop, and 40 men stood in the grange yard and watched the difference between a lie and a made thing with their own eyes. Undeniable, before all witnesses. The county sheriff took the bulletin off the grange table and folded it into his own coat and said it was evidence of fraud, and that no note written against a machine the company knew to be defective would stand, and that he'd have the circuit judge say the same before the month was out. The foreclosures stopped that day. The land that had been taken for pennies came unwound from the courts through the winter, farm by farm, and the valley kept its own. Ainsworth pulled the agency. Marcus Dunmore rode out of Cottonwood Bend under a cloud, alone, and nobody stood on Main Street to see him off. Preston Vane, who'd fronted the company's money and thought himself the safe and proper match, found the parlor doors of the town closed to him one by one. Quiet. The way a town does its cutting. No scene. Just a chair no longer offered. An invitation that stopped coming. By spring, he'd taken his business 2 counties over. Cole Bennett came to the shop after. He came in the late afternoon with the light going honey gold through the shop window, and Etta was at the bench. And she didn't turn around, because she'd left a wrench on his seat and he'd let a town call her a saboteur, and it takes more than a Grange verdict to true a thing that's been bent. "I know," he said, before she could tell him. "I know what I did at the depot. I stood in the street and I unsaw you to save 40 acres of dirt. There's no dressing it up." "No," she said. "There isn't." He came around the bench so she'd have to look at him. In both his hands he held her father's brass wrench. He'd brought it back. He didn't kneel with a ring. He knelt with the wrench, held out flat across both palms, the way you offer a thing back that was never yours to keep. "I let this county call your hands the wrong thing once," Cole Bennett said. "In a field, in front of everybody, I stood there and let them. I won't again. Not ever." His voice went rough. "Della's been gone 2 years. I've not said her name out loud since we buried her, and I loved her, and that's true and it stays true. But grief's not a house you're meant to live in forever. She'd have told me that. She'd have liked you. She'd have told me not to be a slow fool about it." He looked up at her. "Marry a man who'll hand you the tools, Etta. That's all I've got to offer. A man who knows what your hands are worth, and hands you the wrench instead of wiping his off after." She looked at her father's wrench in Cole Bennett's hands. His father's before him. His father's before that. The only inheritance that had ever mattered. She took it, and she took the hand that offered it. "There's a whole valley of reapers going to break come next harvest," she said, which was as near to yes as a woman like her comes. "I know it," he said. "I'll need a bigger forge." "I know that too." The Grange had one more thing coming, though she didn't plan it. Word got round they were to marry, and some of the same men who'd pitied her came by the shop to shake her hand, and one of them, awkward, meaning well, said he supposed she'd be giving up the trade now, being a wife. Etta Slocum looked at the room of them, the same faces from the field, from the hall, the ones who'd said machines were men's business and grease was a shame on a woman. "By noon, gentlemen," she said. That was all. And every man there knew exactly what she meant. The frost came early to Cottonwood Bend that year, the first hard frost silvering the stubble 6 months on, and the Bennett Slocum place ran as one thing now. Farm and shop, land and forge. She kept the reapers of the whole valley cutting. When a machine died anywhere from the river to the county line, they sent for the Wheelwright's girl, only nobody in the valley called her that anymore, not the way they'd used to. They called her, and she came, with good iron and a fire, and she had them cutting by noon, and the phrase had gone from a boast to a fact you could set a clock by. Etta Slocum's trade did not die with his hands. That was the thing that undid the old man some mornings. Watching it, Slocum and daughter, the sign said, paint no longer flaking, because Cole had painted it fresh, and the daughter had made the name mean something the father's failing grip never could have carried alone. The brass wrench hung on a nail by the kitchen door. Not in the shop, in the house, by the door they used every day. It had been a mark of grease once, the badge of the town oddity. The Wheelwright's spinster girl with hands like a man's. It wasn't that anymore. It was the wrench she'd set to a dead reaper's knotter in front of 40 doubting men, the wrench a widower had knelt and held out in both hands, the tool that had turned out to be a marriage token all along. It hung there and caught the morning light and meant the woman who saved the harvest. At dawn, Cole would be in the yard learning, badly, to true a wagon wheel under her hand, because he'd asked her to teach him. Because a man who marries a maker ought to know something of making. He was slow at it. She was patient in a way the field had taught them both, and on Saturday mornings there'd be 2 or 3 of the town's daughters lined at the shop door, girls whose mothers had once stepped wide of Etta on the church walk, come to learn the trade from the only woman in Kansas who could teach it. Worth was in the hands, not the dress. It had always been in the hands. The town had just needed a bad harvest and a good woman and a broken machine to finally learn to read it. Cole stood with her at the fence line one frost-bright morning and looked out over 300 acres cut clean, the sheaves long since in, the land resting under silver. He didn't count it anymore. She'd noticed that. He'd stopped counting acres against a note. There was no note. There was just the land. And the 2 of them. And a field cut clean by hands the county had finally learned the worth of. If you've ever been judged by your dress instead of your heart, by your hands instead of what those hands can do, tell me the name of your town in the comments, and where you're listening from. I'd like to know.